Okay. Hi, Ira. Hi, Nicole. Thanks for joining me again for another podcast. Looks like we'll be discussing today a little bit about data subject rights under POPIA. Ira, do you want to maybe give us a bit of insight into what POPIA actually says about what rights data subjects have?
Sure, Rahkee. So Section 23 of POPIA says that a data subject can come to you and ask you free of charge, what information do you have about me? And then against a prescribed fee, they can ask you for copies of that information. And then, of course, they can ask you to correct incorrect information. And they can also exercise that very infamous right to be forgotten. So the right to be forgotten means delete absolutely the whole record you have about me, forget that I've ever existed. But of course, Rahkee and Nicole, I would love to tell my bank to forget about my mortgage, and they keep on telling me, no, Ira, you owe us money, so we're going to remember about you. So the right to be forgotten must, of course, be balanced against the other party's rights to have your information. So it's always a balancing test here. And also, if I want to access my personal information, there are certain grounds of refusal set out in POPI's sister act, PIA, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, where the responsible party can turn around and say, no, sorry, our rights here outweigh your rights, and we're not going to hand this information over to you. Nicole, do you want to add something here?
I think that obviously an interesting aspect of POPI, in my mind at least, is what do we do in instances when we receive rights of or requests to delete information. And we don't have similar provisions under GDPR where we've got balancing tests which appear in GDPR as to whose rights outweighs who's in relation to keeping information. And what do we do, Rahkee and Ira? What are your views if you receive a request to delete information, but you believe you have a legitimate interest to keep it? And I'm talking outside of having an existing contract with someone per se, or having a legal obligation under legislation to retain information, but where you keep it for furthering your own business interests, and you receive a right to or request to delete information. What do you think we should be doing, or clients should be doing in those instances?
Rahkee, do you want to add something here? Otherwise, I'll go for it.
You go first.
So, Nicole, I think there is no one-size-fits-all approach here. You would have to review this on the merits and decide what your business purpose is for keeping that information. If it is, for example, you are a life insurer and the person used to be a smoker and you have now insured their right, and they say to you, but I want you to forget that I used to smoke or I used to have cancer or something like that, then I think you're very well within your rights to turn around and to say, no, I'm keeping that information. But if, because it certainly is going to affect the way you assess a person's risk, but I think if it is, I want to keep your information for direct marketing purposes, it is in my legitimate business interest to do telemarketing. I think there, obviously, the data subject's rights would outweigh the responsible party's right to keep that information. What are your thoughts, Rahkee?
I think I completely agree that it does depend on the circumstances. What I like to say about data subject rights is that the data subject does have many rights under POPIA, but that does not necessarily mean that the responsible party has to action the request that may be made. They just have to apply their mind to the request and follow the correct process in handling and managing that request. And the outcome may very well be that you choose not to sort of, honor the request made by the data subject because, like you say, they might have a lawful reason for still, keeping the data as is for whatever reason. And I think that is one of the things that some of my clients grapple with is the implementation of, for example, a data subject access policy, or just, when someone phones a call center and they're asking, for their information to be removed from the company database. I think they struggle to firstly recognize what a data subject access request looks like, and then they are not sure on the protocol to be followed. Do you guys have any thoughts about, the process part of data subject access rights?
Absolutely, Rahkee. And I do think that awareness and training is incredibly important, just to teach your people how to spot a data subject access request and to then follow. And it's, as you know, it's mandatory for the information officer to have processes or policies in place to deal with data subject access requests. But those processes and policies mean nothing if your employees can't spot a data subject access request. And as a minimum, you should ask people to do this in writing and identify who you are dealing with. And to make your life a bit easier, you should ask them exactly what information are you looking for. So there's no prescribed form for data subject access requests in terms of POPI, and I certainly do suggest that our clients draft their own so that you just have, you know exactly what you're going to ask the data subject and you standardize it across the board. Nicole, your thoughts on this?
I agree. I mean, I think that obviously it's, in my mind at least, not firmly regulated in terms of a process that must be followed to obtain information. But I do think it's very important to consider two things in that process. One is being able as an entity, when you receive a data subject access request, to be able to verify the details of the person making that request. Particularly where we could have requests coming in via telephonic requests, and where we sit in a society where social engineering fraud is obviously so relevant. If you had a case where I was impersonating Rahkee and phoning in to obtain Rahkee's information, and perhaps requesting that accounts information be redirected from Rahkee's email address to mine, perhaps then in that situation, what do we do if you're able to verify perhaps certain information that I have around Rahkee, and I'm impersonating her obviously and committing a fraud, but do we have checks and balances in place to prevent frauds around these things? So say, for example, I've pretended to be Rahkee, I phoned you, Era, I've answered certain verification questions, and you now then want to execute on diverting information or changing information. What do we do from a technical perspective or an organizational perspective in actually diverting those requests? Do we let the old email address or the old numbers know that we're diverting those requests? So it's not just verifying the request, but it's also finding a mechanism to make sure that in changing any details that we're complying with certain security safeguards. Rahkee, what are your views?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I do think it needs to be a sort of a measured approach. So it depends what information is being changed. If someone wants to change their physical address and you're a company that does deliveries, then you do want to perhaps verify, and maybe, you take steps to ask them for proof of such change of address, for example, or banking details. I mean, that's a big element which is, ripe for cybercrime. Especially even in our sector itself. So I think it just depends on the kinds of information that's being changed. If it's like a direct marketing, change of email address by a person, I'd be very surprised if someone actually did that, but I don't think it requires as much of a check and balance. So I do think that there needs to be some thought behind that, because yes, people are always looking for opportunities to take advantage of data subjects and consumers. So we do, as responsible parties, just need to try and assist our consumers and protect them.
And Nicole, what I liked is, I'm very glad you mentioned telephonic requests, because I said just now that as a minimum, these requests should be made in writing, but sometimes it's not practical. If you think about the banks, they will authenticate you telephonically, and then you can get certain information from them, such as the balance on your account and so on. So I think whether you do it in writing or do a telephonic verification, as a minimum, you must always apply reasonable measures to know who you're dealing with. And again, so important to spot these. And then something to add here is, what is the difference between requests under POPI and requests under POPIA? So of course, if you make a request under POPIA, you're asking for access to a record. And that record may or may not contain personal information, and it may or may not be your own personal information. So POPI is, I want to access my own information, and it must be personal information in terms of POPI. And then, of course, a POPIA request is to access a record, and not necessary personal information. And that brings me to something in POPIA. Did you guys notice the difference between the definition of personal information in POPIA and POPI?
No? What is it, Ira?
So Rahkee, it's too bizarre. Personal information in terms of POPIA doesn't include juristic person information. It's only natural person information. And it includes information of a deceased person unless he's been deceased for longer than 20 years.
Oh, wow. So does that mean, in practice, a juristic data subject wouldn't have the same process that a individual data subject would?
So in terms of POPIA, a juristic person can certainly exercise their right to access records, but just the difference is that definition of personal information. If it is information of a juristic person I'm trying to access, it wouldn't meet the definition of personal information in POPIA. And also you can access deceased person's information in terms of POPIA, and that would be classified as personal information unless they've been deceased for longer than 20 years. So it's just
on that note, I think that's I think where the maybe the important distinction between the two pieces of legislation can be drawn, and it's fascinating that you've raised that because I didn't actually know that, and I think it's really interesting to see what that will lead to. But I think where that perhaps focuses my mind, at least, is that a POPIA request is focused, as you say, on a record meaning a number of things. A data subject access request is focused on obtaining information relating to personal information, which may or may not be a record. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ira, on where you think the differences are between data subject access requests and POPIA requests.
So Nicole, it's quite interesting. So if I make my POPI request for personal information, POPI would only apply if the personal information has been entered into a record. So there would also be a record. But I think the main distinction between POPI and POPIA here would be that POPI always involves personal information. So of course, if it's not personal information that has been entered into the record, POPI wouldn't apply, and your data subject access request wouldn't be a POPI data subject access request. Whereas POPIA doesn't care too much if there's personal information in the record or not. So POPIA says it may or may not be personal information, and it may be the requester's own personal information or third party's personal information. So I think POPIA here is a lot wider than POPI is, and would also involve me wanting like your personal information or information relating to you that may not even be personal information, but I guess if it relates to you, it would almost invariably be personal information. So it's quite interesting. And also if I do a POPIA request, I need to show that I need that information to implement or to exercise one of my rights. And of course, I can't just say, well, my right is my right to health or my right to privacy or my right to education. I must also, in my POPIA request, set out what I want to achieve with this record of information. How is that going to help me to exercise my rights? And then also something interesting as far as data subject requests are concerned in terms of POPI, I found it interesting that many of my clients haven't received one of these. And then one of my clients received 100 of these, over 100, after they sent out their privacy notice. So it's quite interesting, just the demographic of data subjects that would be making these requests. And I guess some clients would never even see one of these requests. Have you guys experienced any sort of practical issues or interesting things as far as these requests are concerned?
I mean, I know that although there are, provisions in POPIA that prevent people from doing this, when people are either contemplating litigation, and Nicole, this is more your area than mine, I know that many people try and use POPIA as an avenue for furthering some other agenda that they might have. So they really do try to use POPIA to gain access to information, maybe when they probably have other rights or remedies. That's the most common one so far.
So just it's interesting because Ira, you and Rahkee both raise good points there. So I certainly haven't come across there being an influx of data subject access requests, barring perhaps on one or two isolated events, as when POPI went live and the privacy notices flew out. But I certainly am seeing an uptick in PIA requests. And Ira, do you agree with that statement, that there's certainly more PIA requests going on at the moment than previously?
Oh, absolutely, Nicole. Yes. In the last 10 years, I think I dealt with maybe 2 or 3. In the last month, we've dealt with 2 or 3 additional ones.
Absolutely. And then, Rahkee, to your point on using it for avenues of litigation, I see both PIA and POPI being potential weapons, and I use weapons loosely in that sense, but avenues for people to obtain information. But remember, the trick there is always that you have to properly use the mechanism. So where we've already got litigation that's commenced, PIA is absolutely not an avenue you can use. In fact, it's a ground for refusal under PIAs where you've got litigation that's commenced. And we should then be using ordinary processes like discovery and subpoenas and the like for getting the evidence we require. But where you're trying to establish whether or not you've got a right to protect or that may perhaps have been infringed is where PIA is useful as a pre-litigation tool. But again, what you have to do is carefully articulate what right it is you're trying to protect. And again, that record needs to be relevant to that right. So you can't just cast a net and want any records, whether or not they would act in furtherance of a right. If that record is irrelevant or wouldn't further that right, it can necessarily be refused. And the other thing that I see happening a lot is that the rights, the requests as they come in, albeit under POPIA or under PIA, are being very widely cast so that there's not enough particularity to actually understand what right is being protected and what record is being sought. What are your thoughts on those in terms of refusing requests under POPIA or PIA when the requests are vague, Ira or Rahkee?
Well, Nicole, I certainly think that you can refuse them if you simply don't know what they're asking for. But I think you must just be mindful of the duties on information officers. I think there's a duty on an information officer to help somebody to complete a PIA request and to help them to complete a POPI request if they're battling to complete this. So I think certainly if we turn an illiterate person away because their request is not perfectly articulated, I think that would go against the spirit of the legislation. But again, no one-size-fits-all approach. You'd have to judge each case on the merits.
So if we had to leave, our listeners with just, I guess, a few takeaways, what would be the one thing that you would want them to know about data subjects' access rights? Maybe I'll go first. I think that it's so important that not only do you have a data subject, access request policy, but that you actually implement it and train your employees on how to use the policy, whether it's identifying an access request or the protocol to inform and bring in the information officer. It's quite important that that training happens. Nicole?
I think that we must remember that failures to respond to proper PIA requests and data subject access requests, either one of those can lead to complaints to the information regulator, and in itself can lead to enforcement action and or fines and even court proceedings. So avoiding those requests to avoid anything in court may not get you where you want to be if you could end up in a process where you're being investigated anyways. So to have a properly considered and measured consideration of any request, and as Ira was saying, to give effect to the spirit of the legislation in trying to respond to these requests wherever it's reasonable and proper to do so. Ira?
And I'm going to pick the easy one, Rahkee. I'm going to say, remember, you must have a PIA manual and you must make it available on your website and you must make it available at your head office. And your information regulator can go to jail if you don't have a PIA manual, if you grossly, negligently and willfully don't have a POPIA manual. So very, very important that you tick the boxes there.
No, for sure. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Rahkee, Nicole.
Bye.
Chat soon.